Hello, and welcome to the very first ever episode of the Talk Over Coffee podcast, where we talk over coffee. Woohoo! I'm your host, Ash, and today I have a very excited episode planned. I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 5 favorite study hacks that have not only worked for me, but also a lot of people I know, so I'm very hopeful and excited to share them with you guys today. I've made myself a nice cup of iced coffee, which I thought was only fitting for this very first episode. Since it is our very first episode, I thought I'd share with you guys a little bit of what I have planned for this first season and the podcast overall. So whether you choose to listen to this while you're driving, cleaning, walking, or my personal favorite time to listen to a podcast, which is when I'm getting ready/unready for the day or night, my goal is to make this a very uplifting, lighthearted, fun space to be around for everybody. Like you're having a conversation with a friend that you haven't spoken to in a long time, so you just have so much to tell each other. I hope to keep this a very freeing and safe place for everybody that they can leave feeling better than before. I plan to talk all things from life advice, girl talk, relationships, and life in general, all the way to just casual chit-chatting from one person to another as we talk over coffee. I have a lot planned for this upcoming season, and I have a list of things that I'd like to talk about over each episode. So far, some of my top contenders are dealing with stress, let's talk books, all about friendships, mental health, a guide to becoming that girl, being the therapist friend, girl talk, and there's a lot more where those came from. I'd also love to hear your guys' suggestions, so don't be afraid to leave them in the comments, and I am sure to look over them. Without any further ado, let's start getting into these study tips. Before I start, let me preface this by saying that everybody studies differently, everyone has different methods that work for them, so take what I say with a grain of salt, and feel free to adjust them in any way that works best for you. And these are also no particular order, they're just the top 5 things that came to mind that I use almost every time I'm studying, because they're very easy and very beneficial to do each time. The first tip on my list is about your environment. Whether you're studying or working on a digital space or in a physical space, make sure that it's really clean, organized, and accessible for you. If I'm working on a physical desk, I want to make sure that I have everything I need laid out for me, and if I have a bunch of papers, I don't leave them in a pile. I have them organized by the way that I need them. So if I'm studying for, let's say, a specific test that's coming up, I would organize my notes in order from the things that I know the least to the things that I know the best, so that it's easy to work with. If you're working on a digital platform, it's also important to not have a billion tabs open that are really unorganized, and you don't have 17 windows open with like music coming from nowhere. Make sure it's organized and beneficial for you where you know everything is. You can group tabs together, which I love doing, and put them in specific units or specific categories. The benefits of doing this is it'll help you stay focused on the task at hand, and it'll also save a lot of time of you trying to find things that are in an unorganized mess and piles all over the room. Try to keep everything in a contained area and only have the things there that you need. If there's something that you already know, I'd recommend separating it into a different pile and just reviewing it a couple of times and separating the things that you really need to study in a different pile so that you know you need to work on those more than the rest, rather than having everything in just one big clump. It's also good to not only have your digital and physical space organized and clean and focused, but to also have your mental space focused, which brings me to my second tip. My second tip is about noise and senses going on while you're studying. It's really important that your mind stays focused on the task that you're trying to work on, and if your mind is just distracted, going on different tangents, don't be afraid to take a break and come back to it later. One of the best ways to keep your mind focused on the task at hand is to make sure all of your senses are busy doing something that isn't too difficult that you need to give too much brain power towards, but distracting enough that they won't take you off topic. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but let me give you a couple examples. The main one that's pretty distracting is sound and in your ears and hearing. A lot of people think that they need to study the best with silence, which does work for a lot of people, but it's really hard to get that silence, especially if you live in an apartment or with other people or near a loud street. It's really hard to get that pure silent effect. In my opinion, I like to listen to some music without lyrics because the lyrics can be distracting and your mind might pay attention to that over what you're trying to read or study. Even sounds like white noise, rain, or anything that works for you. There's a bunch of different kinds of study sounds out there now. I recently heard about brown and pink noise, which can also work if that's what you're into. Something I personally like to listen to is I found these remixes, I guess, where it's the sound of rain, but far off in the distance is a song. So it's like, I think it's called something along the lines of it's raining, but there's music playing in the other room or something like that. And it's really peaceful, especially if the song is not one with lyrics or it's an instrumental version. It really just, your mind doesn't have to pay attention to it. Oftentimes it will actually zone it out, but it's also, your mind doesn't have that opportunity to find little noises that's happening in the background that can be distracting, or people's conversations in the background that can also be distracting. The second most important sense that can get distracted is your touch or feeling, or just moving around in general. If you're somebody whose work or study does not require their hands or body going into it, such as typing or writing, then I recommend to get some simple fidgets, not ones that would make too many clicking noises or anything that would be too complicated or something like that. But some of the options that I like are fidget rings, which are just like spring coil sort of wire that you can put on your ring and move up and down, and it just has a sensory sort of pressure put onto your fingers so they have something to do. Another option is getting a good chair, which also is part of your environment. Make sure your chair is comfortable because you'll be moving around a lot if it's not. And even if you do have a comfortable chair, I recommend one that can have a little bit of move to it. It's not super fixed in its place. That way that you can just, if you shift a little bit, it doesn't feel like you're stuck in a place or you're sort of stuck and imprisoned in this space and you don't have room to move around. If these still don't work for you, the next thing that I have on my list is increments, breaks, and spacing out. When you're studying, it's easy to get unmotivated and distracted, and you sort of feel like you are forcing yourself to do the work. Once you get to that point, your work is not going to be to the best of your abilities. The best thing to do then is to take a break and get away from the space, not just get away from the work and go on your phone, but physically get up and go into a different room or a different space, because it can really help just ease down and take a break and get your mind cleaned out so that when you go back you can be more focused than ever, and it's really beneficial. I know some people who actually set timers that they don't make noise, like they're not sort of jumpy timers, but they set timers in increments of 10 minutes study, 5 minutes break, 10 minutes study, 5 minutes break, which helps them. You can change those time limits to whatever works for you. That way they know they need to take a break, and it's worked for a lot of people. For me personally, I like to just wait until I feel unmotivated and then I leave, so I don't have a specific time. But for a lot of people, the time works better, so find what works for you, because it's really important to take breaks in between your work or study so that you can actually feel motivated to do it. Similarly, also space out your work or studying throughout the week or time that you have to do it. Don't cram it all into one day. Space it out. If you have a week to study and you have a certain number of pages to read a couple pages each day and leave the last day for review. So don't leave the last day for like, oh, I have to read another 100 pages. I like to leave that last day just for review and going over everything I can. For me personally, I'd probably have to say that the increments, breaks, and spacing out tip is probably the most important, but there's not even that much that goes into it. Just make sure you take breaks when your body's telling you you need them. My next tip on the list is skimming. So if you don't know how to skim, it's a very important skill to have because sometimes you'll get a bucket load of reading that you need to do in one night or 1 week, and it's just too much and you feel unmotivated to actually sit down and start reading it. A lot of people, they skim and highlight basically every word that they're not actually paying attention to what it says. So my personal favorite way of skimming is breaking it up by paragraphs. So usually an article or textbook or whatever you're reading will be already separated into paragraphs. So how I skim is I will read all the way through the first paragraph and the very last paragraph, just to get an understanding of what the whole article or chapter is going to be about. Then I will read the first 2 lines and the last 2 lines of every paragraph in between that. If I find a paragraph where those first 2 lines and last 2 lines seem very important, then I will go in and continue reading that entire paragraph. That way I'm not spending 5 hours reading an entire book, but instead I'm spending maybe 45 minutes skimming through it and then finding the things that I really need to read, and then spending an hour reading the important things and not reading all the nonsensical things. Now my final tip comes down to how you actually review and study. I mentioned before about highlighting and how oftentimes people highlight things that they don't actually need. So in my opinion, highlighting is fun, but it doesn't really work that well for me. I don't go back and read the highlighted things. Oftentimes I'll just go back and skim the whole thing that I was highlighting. So it doesn't work very well for me, and I know for a lot of people it doesn't work for them. So the best way to take notes or write down things to go back and review on is to take written notes in bullet points or in a grid style. There's a lot of different ways to take notes. I like to make it in a sort of a table. So on my paper, I make like a T-chart, and I'll put bullet points, and either if I'm comparing two ideas, or I'll put all the points on one side, and then after that, I'll put the important points on the other side. It's kind of confusing, but that just works for me. You can find whatever works for you. There's so many options out there on the internet. One quick Google search should do that for you. Flashcards also are very beneficial. If you don't know how to use flashcards, there's so many different ways to use them as well. The most popular is to write a question on one side and the answer on the other, which is a very good way of studying. Instead of reading, you actually write down questions for yourself and answer them. So instead of memorizing, you're actually learning, which is one of the most important things to do when you're studying. You can also use flashcards by color coordinating them into different topics or different important levels. One of the ways I like to color code is by levels of my knowledge on them. So let's say I have red, blue, and yellow. Red will be things that I know pretty well. Yellow is things that I'm not too sure on. And blue are the things that I really need to study. I don't really know anything about them. That way I will go through and I'll study blue first, then yellow, then red. So I'll study blue for an hour, I'll study yellow for 30 minutes, and I'll study red for 15 minutes, something like that. Again, find what works for you. That's the most important thing about studying, is finding what works for you, because there are so many different kinds of people out there that all study or work differently. So if you do try these tips, make sure you take them with a grain of salt, try them, don't expect them to work like magic, because it all depends on you and how you go about them. So I really hope that you can learn something from this. I hope that if you do try these tips, they work well for you, and that you can find your studying way and find the best way to study for yourself, and that you start to maybe enjoy studying, which can be really difficult. So good luck on whatever you're doing. And with that, my coffee is all finished. So sadly, so is our conversation for today. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this very first episode of the Talk Over Coffee podcast. I hope to chat with you all next week. See you then when we talk over coffee.